So do you think it's a difference in the type of wealth that they have? So you mentioned sort of like Rishi Sunak, who just can move and can potentially just take his wealth with him because, whatever it's in the markets, as opposed to the class of the old who really had it tied up in the land. So if they got driven off the land, they had no more assets. And so today you have this sort of oligarchy, if you will, but they sort of have this wealth that's like global wealth, and they could just kind of go wherever. And do you think that's sort of like one of the main things that really changes the skin of the game, if you will, on that?
Mm-hmm. I think that's certainly part of it. And I think kind of the other aspect of it is if you look at how wealth was measured in, say, 1800, and the novels of Jane Austen are great for this, it wasn't the capital value of whatever asset was, whether bonds or land or anything. It was the income it produced, because that's what the person who held it could live off of. And then because they didn't have to worry about having an income, they could serve the state and were expected to do so, whether it was in parliament or the military. America, similarly with Congress and military. That died around the same time the shift transitioned, and now we never hear about someone's income unless it's just some ridiculous situation. Instead, we hear about the nominal value of their capital wealth.
Right.
And I think what's implied by that is that it's going to be sold. Because, if it's, I think Amazon doesn't pay a dividend. If you have Amazon stock, you might have a huge nominal wealth, but you're going to have to sell it to get anything out of that. And if you're selling it, that means it's not permanent. Of course, I think the exception are bearer assets like Bitcoin, because hopefully you don't want to sell those, right, or gold. But, if it's a financial asset that's not producing a yield or it's not producing income from it, you have to sell it. And as such, your time horizons are not infinite. They're not for, 7 generations down the line. It's instead a much shorter timeline. It's, what's going to happen in the next year or two, because I'm going to need to think about this. And I think that is something we see with our elite is, Nancy Pelosi will make a stock trade that everyone hears about, or Dan Crenshaw will do the same and everyone will hear about it.
Yeah.
And they never focus on the dividends of the companies they trade. They're just trading them based on political events. And I think we see that a lot. It's this short-termism that's inculcated by the way wealth was measured and the global nature of it.
Although you have, Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk being the richest man in the world because he didn't sell his stock or trade his stock, and he has just owned it. Although there are stories of Musk kind of being broke and having no money at all. Right, I've seen stories of that, and then you have on the other side, you have not so much in the U.S. as well, but maybe over in England as well. It's like maybe multiple generations that have owned a castle or some part of land, but there's no income from that. So now they own this land, they own this castle, they can't even afford to keep it up. So is that because the wealth has shifted away from that type of asset, or what happened there?
That's a really interesting story. So that was one of the changes that happened at the end of the 19th century. Two things kind of came to a head. One was the opening of the American Midwest. We don't really think about it in these terms, but if you look at what the prairie was in, say, 1870, it was this virgin territory with 14, 15 feet of incredibly fertile topsoil where you didn't need fertilizers. You could just plow it and plant grain. And also railroads meant that you could take that grain anywhere. Steamships, railroads, it could go from Kansas to Britain in the relative blink of an eye. So this entire half of a continent was open up to grain growing. And I promise this get into your question. It's got agriculture history. But all this grain was grown, and the same thing was happening in the Ukrainian region of the Russian Empire to a lesser extent. And it's all this grain from this incredibly fertile soil, which meant the cost of production was near zero. Because of steam and rail, the cost of transportation was near zero. So anywhere that up to this point had some degree of struggle, or at least had to care about how they grew things, could now just import it. There's so much grain that they could just import where people could be fed and prices were low, which was good because it fed people. The problem was without tariffs, which were called corn laws and died out around the end of the 1840s in England and kind of similarly elsewhere. Although Prussia, anyway, England, I think, is a great example because it got rid of its corn laws. So its agricultural market was open. And in the 1870s, grain starts pouring into England, particularly the end of the end of the 70s. And it sets up this agricultural depression because what the traditional tenant system was, there's a tenant farmer who rented a, say, 300-acre farm from the lord who owned, say, 3,000 acres. And the tenant would pay rent to the lord and then keep the rest of the profits from the farm. That worked pretty well when grain was a reasonable price. When it became super cheap because of imports, the farms died. Both the farmers just had no ability to grow anything for profit anymore, and the lords, who up to that point had been renting the land and then serving in the military or parliament, no longer had any rents to draw on, so they started having to sell things. Their time horizons became shorter. And paired with that were death taxes, because up to this point, death taxes had been pretty much gone. They're really briefly revived under Napoleon, but because they're one of the most hated taxes of the medieval system, just caused barons' wars, caused all this trouble, the governments had gotten rid of them. They came back around the turn of the century. Winston Churchill and Lord George were largely responsible for that. And Britain and America just followed suit with Wilson. And death taxes meant that now, when you died, you started to have to sell land. But land wasn't worth as much because of the Depression. And so it's this huge blocks of land going on an illiquid market for asset that no one wants. And it wiped out the estates. It's kind of my point. So you have these grand country houses, Highclere, Chatsworth. Highclere was falling apart before Downton Abbey. But there's no land to fund it because it's all been taxed away. And the problem with those taxes was it was the nominal value of the land, not the income it produced. So when they're not producing income and you have to sell the whole thing, the estate's just decayed. It takes the assets out of the old owners who kind of cared about it for the future and puts it in the hands of people who don't really care. They're going to put a solar farm on top of it that's going to poison the agricultural land. And that's what we're seeing now. So yeah, they were just taxed away in the Depression and knocked them out. It's the unintended consequences of these policies.
And that's what we see in the U.S. today, right? Where it's like, to your point, they're putting solar panels on the land, which makes it more valuable. But if you want to farm it, you can't make enough income to pay the taxes.
Right. You know, the American equivalent, one of the closest ones, is if you look at the Main Street the main street of these towns in the Midwest that used to be these thriving industrial hubs, you know, whether it was producing lead pipe or wing nuts or shoes or whatever it was, all of that got outsourced because of free trade and these different policies. So now where it used to be, there's a relatively prosperous upper class that owned the factories, middle class that kind of did the administration of them, and working class that worked in them. All of that was just obliterated by these policies. So now what used to be these thriving little towns that led to human flourishing, which I think is the end goal of civilization within them, now they're just, some people do fentanyl there, and otherwise there's tumbleweeds going through. It's really horrific.
How much of that is policy versus just technology? So if you think about technology going back right through history, it's always sort of changed the way that we work and communicate and organize, changes the balance of power, all of those things, right? So you have the Industrial Revolution that brought people into cities and factories, and then you had, Henry Ford creating the assembly line, which created this massive middle class, everybody sort of equal on an assembly line almost.
Right.
So then you created this mass management system to manage everybody like a cog in a wheel. Then you created like a mass government structure to manage all of that. So you have this massive middle class because everybody was sort of equal, putting their cog on the wheel. But now we've sort of gone from the industrial age to the information age, right? And so now certainly those low-paying industrial jobs have gone overseas to lower-paying workers, but in the information age, it allows knowledge workers to excel faster because some people are just smarter. There's not a egalitarian, right? And so I think about sometimes, certainly we've sent the middle class over to China. We could bring those jobs back, but wouldn't that be akin to putting people in the field to pick cotton and strawberries? They're low-paying jobs today, right? And so how much of it was, some of it was policy for sure, but how much would you say it's just times change, technology has shifted that?
So I think there are two issues there. One, you're definitely right that the current knowledge economy empowers the people who are able to take advantage of that, which is good, and I think a good thing generally, because people are able to do these things they wouldn't have been able to do before. It costs next to nothing to start a business now, which is very good and has empowered a lot of people. So I think you're right on that. There are just these changes. I think the other side, though, is that we still need steel. We still need natural gas. We still need oil. In some places, these companies are able to thrive. Germany, up until the kind of recent unpleasantness, had a thriving industrial sector alongside its other thriving sectors. And I think what you get there, or what you got in, say, 1900 in America with McKinley, are policies meant to protect the innovative companies that produce these things. So Nucor is a steel maker in America that is much more efficient than U.S. Steel. They use electric arc weld, or they use electricity rather than coal, essentially, for their production of steel, from what I understand. And it makes them very competitive with the Chinese market, say. So whereas U.S. Steel just got hammered by these Chinese imports, Nucor has been able to hold on and do reasonably well. I think what you want, though, is you want more of those domestic jobs being produced, because not everyone can succeed in the knowledge economy. And I think to have a thriving internal market, you need jobs for people different ways up the ladder. So you don't want these legacy companies just being zombie companies and holding on because of tariffs and drawing in resources that they shouldn't be. But you also don't want to stifle domestic innovation by letting people who have other interests take advantage of your market. Like when China, for example, is subsidizing its steel sector so that the price can be much lower than whatever America without those subsidies can produce. I think that creates a problem. So I think both sides of it are true. I think you want to protect domestic innovation without just turning things stagnant, which is a tough line to walk, but I think it's important.